Karen Whitfield stood in her second-story window at 6:47 a.m., binoculars trained on the Henderson property, when she witnessed what she would later describe to the emergency HOA board meeting as an act of suburban terrorism. The Hendersons had just fired up their brand-new above-ground pool filter without proper HOA approval. The mechanical hum cut through the morning silence like a chainsaw through her perfectly manicured dreams of neighborhood compliance. "Rachel," she bellowed down the hallway, her voice cracking like a whip. "They've done it. They've actually done it." But the most shocking moment came when she marched across the street in her silk pajamas and fuzzy slippers, clutching the HOA handbook like a weapon, and discovered something that made her blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels. The Hendersons were actually enjoying themselves. 10-year-old Tommy Henderson cannonballed into the water while his parents laughed, as if community guidelines meant nothing. "Excuse me," Karen's voice carried across 3 zip codes. "This pool is in direct violation of Section 14.7b of the Meadowbrook Estates Community Guidelines." Jim Henderson, dripping wet and grinning, climbed out of the pool. "Morning, Karen. Beautiful day, isn't it?" The audacity, the sheer, unbridled audacity. "You don't understand," Karen said, her hands trembling as she flipped through the handbook. "This is a flagrant disregard for property values, aesthetic harmony, and the very fabric that holds our community together." "Karen, it's just a pool," said Susan Henderson, floating peacefully on an inflatable flamingo. "We submitted the application 3 months ago." "Denied," Karen shrieked, though she hadn't actually checked her files. "Obviously denied. Do you see any approval stamps? Any official documentation? Any regard for your neighbor's well-being?" That's when she noticed something that would haunt her for weeks. Other neighbors had gathered to watch. And worse, they were smiling. The Changs from 2 houses down gave the Hendersons a thumbs up. Mrs. Rodriguez from across the street was actually taking photos, probably for social media, probably mocking the HOA's authority. Karen felt the ground shifting beneath her perfectly pedicured feet. This wasn't just about pool regulations anymore. This was about respect, about order, about the very foundation of civilized society. "I'm calling an emergency board meeting," she announced, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And I'm personally reviewing every single permit, application, and approval from the past 5 years. If you think you can just splash around in your little plastic pond without consequences, you're sorely mistaken." She spun on her heel, marched back across the street, and immediately began drafting what would become known in Meadowbrook Estates history as the Henderson Incident Report, a 17-page document that would eventually reach the county commissioner's office. The war had begun, and Karen Whitfield had no intention of losing. 3 days after the pool incident, Karen had transformed her home office into what her husband Richard nervously called the war room. Maps of the neighborhood covered every available wall surface, marked with different colored pins representing various violations she'd discovered during her investigation. Red pins for unapproved modifications, yellow for questionable landscaping choices, and blue for what she termed aesthetic infractions. The Henderson pool incident had opened her eyes to a conspiracy of non-compliance that ran deeper than she'd ever imagined. "Susan," she called to her neighbor and reluctant HOA board member, Susan Pike, who'd made the mistake of answering her doorbell. "You need to see this." Susan Pike stood in Karen's doorway, coffee mug in hand, taking in the chaos. "Karen, what exactly am I looking at?" "Evidence," Karen said dramatically, gesturing toward a corkboard covered in photographs. The Hendersons' pool was just the tip of the iceberg. "Look at this." She pointed to a photo of the Johnson house. Pink flamingo lawn ornament. Clearly states in Section 12.3 that decorative yard elements must be tasteful and community appropriate. It's 1 flamingo, Karen. 1 flamingo leads to 2 flamingos. 2 flamingos lead to garden gnomes. Garden gnomes lead to 2. Karen's voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "Above-ground pools." Susan sipped her coffee slowly. "You've been at this for 72 hours straight, haven't you?" Karen's investigation had indeed consumed her completely. She'd driven through the neighborhood 17 times, documenting every minor deviation from HOA standards. Her phone contained 247 photos of potential violations, from slightly overgrown hedges to mailboxes that were possibly 3 inches too tall. But her masterpiece was the spreadsheet, a comprehensive database of every resident's compliance history, color-coded by severity and cross-referenced with property values and voting patterns from previous HOA elections. "Richard's threatening to hide my car keys," Karen admitted, momentarily vulnerable. "He says I'm losing perspective. But someone has to maintain standards. Someone has to care about property values." That's when Susan noticed the bags under Karen's eyes, the coffee-stained blouse she'd been wearing for 2 days, and the slight tremor in her hands as she shuffled through her documentation. "Karen, maybe you should." "No." Karen's composure cracked completely. "You don't understand. They're all laughing at us, at the HOA. Yesterday I saw 3 different neighbors take photos of their own properties and post them online with captions like HOA approved fun and living my best non-compliant life." The truth was, Karen's investigation had revealed something more troubling than violations. The community was bonding over their shared amusement at her expense. Group texts were flying. Social media posts were gaining traction. Someone had even created a Facebook group called Meadowbrook Pool Watch, where neighbors shared memes about HOA overreach. "I'm scheduling individual compliance meetings," Karen announced, pulling out a thick folder. "Every household, starting tomorrow. If they want to play games, we'll play by the rules, all the rules." Susan Pike set down her coffee mug with a clink that seemed to echo through the room. "Karen, you can't force 37 families into compliance meetings over a pool." "Watch me," Karen said, and for the first time in Susan's memory, she actually looked dangerous. The Meadowbrook Estates Community Center had never seen anything like it. Karen had called what she termed mandatory compliance consultations, but what showed up looked more like a town hall revolt. 37 families packed into a room designed for 20, armed with their own documentation, legal pads, and an attitude that made Karen's carefully planned presentation feel like walking into a hurricane. "Before we begin," Karen announced, standing behind a folding table laden with binders, "I want to make it clear that these meetings are not optional. Section 3.2 of your homeowner agreements clearly states." "Karen," interrupted Mike Rodriguez, "we've been neighbors for 8 years. My kids play with your kids. Why are we here arguing about pool permits like we're in some kind of tribunal?" The room murmured agreement, but Karen pressed on, flipping open her largest binder. "Because Mr. Rodriguez, community standards exist for a reason. When the Hendersons installed their pool without proper approval, we did get approval." Jim Henderson stood up, waving a stamped document. "Right here. Approved by you 3 months ago." Karen's world tilted. She grabbed the document, her hands shaking as she examined the official HOA seal, her own signature, the date clearly marked. In her zealous investigation, she'd somehow forgotten her own approval. This must be," she stammered, but the damage was spreading through the room like wildfire. Neighbors began pulling out their own approved permits. The pink flamingo lawn ornament, approved for seasonal display. The Johnsons' new fence height, approved with conditions. Even the Chang's decorative mailbox, approved after revision. "Karen," said Susan Pike gently, "maybe we should take a break." But Karen couldn't stop. Weeks of investigation, sleepless nights, the elaborate spreadsheets, the color-coded maps. It all came crashing down as she realized she'd been fighting shadows of her own creation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "Property values, community standards, if everyone just does whatever they want." "Karen," said Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow from Maple Street, "my property value went up 12% last year. The assessor said it was because our neighborhood feels lived in and welcoming, not like some sterile showplace." The room fell quiet. Karen looked around at faces she'd known for years. People who'd attended her barbecues, borrowed her ladder, helped her move furniture. When had they become the enemy? She started, then stopped. The truth was sitting there, waiting to be acknowledged. She'd been so focused on maintaining control that she'd lost sight of what made a community worth preserving. "The pool is really nice," she said quietly. "Tommy looks happy." Jim Henderson smiled. "Want to come over for a swim sometime? The water's perfect." Karen felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, but opening. I don't actually know how to swim." The admission hung in the air, vulnerable and honest. Then Susan Pike laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine warmth. "Well then," Susan said, "looks like the first rule of pool club is, everyone learns to swim." For the first time in weeks, Karen felt herself smile. But as she gathered her binders and prepared to leave, she noticed one document that hadn't been discussed, a permit application that actually was problematic, submitted by a new resident she'd never met. The war might be over, but apparently, the paperwork never ended. 2 months later, Karen Whitfield stood in the shallow end of the Hendersons' pool, wearing a sensible one-piece swimsuit and the most genuine smile she'd worn in years. Susan Pike was attempting to teach her the backstroke, while Tommy Henderson provided enthusiastic but questionable coaching from the pool deck. "You're thinking too much?" Tommy called out. "Just float and kick." "Easy for you to say," Karen sputtered, windmilling her arms. "You're practically part fish." The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After the disastrous community meeting, Karen had spent 3 days in what Richard diplomatically called recalibration mode, essentially hiding in her bedroom, eating ice cream, and questioning every decision she'd made since becoming HOA president. But the real change started when Jim Henderson knocked on her door with a peace offering. Homemade cookies and a genuine invitation to join the neighborhood's summer potluck planning committee. "We could use someone with your organizational skills," he'd said. "Maybe channel that energy into something fun instead of, well, you know." Now, as she managed to float for 3 whole seconds without panicking, Karen realized she'd discovered something more valuable than perfect compliance: actual community. "Karen," Susan called from the pool deck, "your backstroke is improving, but you're still trying to control the water. Sometimes you have to trust and let go." The metaphor wasn't lost on her. In her new role as community events coordinator, a position she created for herself after stepping down as HOA president, Karen had learned to channel her attention to detail into organizing block parties, coordinating neighborhood beautification projects, and yes, ensuring pool safety protocols were followed, but with collaboration, not confrontation. The best part was discovering that her neighbors actually appreciated her skills when applied constructively. Her color-coded spreadsheets now tracked volunteer schedules for the community garden, and her investigative thoroughness had proven invaluable when researching contractors for the playground renovation project. "Look out, Karen!" Tommy shouted. "Cannonball incoming!" Karen squeaked and scrambled toward the pool wall, just as Tommy launched himself into the deep end, sending a massive splash across the deck. She found herself laughing, at the chaos she once would have seen as a violation of pool etiquette. "You know," she said to Susan as they toweled off, "I spent so much time trying to control everything that I forgot why communities exist in the first place." "Oh?" Susan raised an eyebrow. "And why's that?" "Because life's more fun when you share it," Karen said, then grinned. "Plus, someone has to make sure the pool chemical levels are properly maintained. Did you know the pH was 0.2 higher than optimal last week?" Susan groaned. And there she is, the Karen we know and love. As the evening wound down and neighbors began heading home, Karen noticed a familiar car pulling into the driveway next door. The new resident, the one whose permit application had been genuinely problematic, was moving in this weekend. She'd done her research, of course. Standard procedure for a responsible community member, but something about the application had bothered her, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what. "Hey Karen," Jim called out, "ready to welcome our new neighbor? I heard they're planning some kind of backyard renovation project." Karen smiled, but her trained eye was already assessing the moving truck, the workers, the equipment being unloaded. Old habits died hard, and her instincts were pinging warnings she couldn't yet identify. Of course, she said cheerfully. I'll bring them a welcome basket tomorrow. What she didn't mention was that she'd also be bringing a copy of the community guidelines, not as a weapon this time, but as a genuine resource. Because sometimes, the best defense against real problems was knowing the difference between harmless pool parties and something more serious. The pool war was over, but Karen Whitfield's story in Meadowbrook Estates was just beginning.